Covenanters or Reformed Presbyterians in 19th century America and how they tackled the issue of slavery. Nathan Robinson Johnston began his autobiography of 1898 looking back from the sunset land with a description of the pictures hanging on the walls of his California home. Two of the pictures depicted scenes from the killing times in late 17th century Scotland. One showed a conventicle, an outdoor religious gathering, and the other, the Battle of Drumclog, a Covenanter victory over the forces of the Crown in 1679. There were also several portraits. One was of James Renwick Wilson, the writer's theological professor, whom he described as a true Covenanter and zealous abolitionist. Another was of the journalist and tireless opponent of slavery, William Lloyd Garrison. A third showed John Brown, considered by Johnston to have died a martyr's death when he was executed in 1859, following a failed attempt to start a slave rebellion. Anyone reading the first paragraph of Johnston's autobiography could not have been left in doubt on two things about this man. First of all, that he was a Covenanter, and secondly, that he was a passionate opponent of slavery. To many observers of 19th century America, the two were inextricably linked. Johnston was indeed a Covenanter and grew up with stories of how he descended from the famous Archibald Johnston of Warriston, one of the architects of Scotland's National Covenant in 1638. Slavery was, without doubt, one of those important and emotive issues in early to mid-19th century America. It was an issue that divided the country and gave rise to fervent debate as well as violence, and was one of the key factors that led to the Civil War. What we're going to be doing in this talk is to look at the attitudes towards slavery of one of the smaller denominations in America, the Reformed Presbyterian Church. Here, just as they are there, known as the Covenanters. Now, by way of background, the Covenanters have been seeking a new home across the Atlantic since the late 17th century. It was not, however, until 1774 that the first Reformed Presbytery was established in America. Just 8 years later, however, all of its ministers, though not all of its members, joined with the Associate Presbytery, the Seceders, to form a new denomination in America. Now, in the late 1780s, the process that led to the re-establishment of the Reformed Presbyterian Church as a distinct denomination in America began. A number of men were sent out from Ireland and Scotland to conduct itinerant missions among the remnant of the Covenanters who had not joined with the Seceders. Among them was James McGarry, who was ordained at Brady for work in America in 1789. Another was William King from Donegal, who, having been licensed by the Reformed Presbytery of Scotland and following several years preaching in the Coleraine area, sailed for America in 1792, settling in South Carolina. Now that there were two Covenanter ministers in America, they were authorised by their brethren back home to act as a committee. They were soon joined by two other ministers. One was the celebrated Reverend William Martin. In 1757, at the Vow near Resharkin, Martin had been ordained the first Reformed Presbyterian minister in Ireland. In 1772, he led a major exodus of Covenanter families, mainly from County Antrim to South Carolina. Something of a maverick, Martin won fame for his courage during the American War of Independence. The other minister to join McCara and King was the Reverend James McKinney, a native of either Cookstown or Kilrea. The sources disagree. McKinney had been ordained in 1783 and served a congregation of Covenanters in North Antrim. In 1793, he preached a sermon on the rights of God as a direct challenge to the prevailing humanistic philosophy of the rights of man. This was denounced by the authorities as treasonable, and McKinney was forced to flee to America to escape arrest. Another caught up in these revolutionary times who was forced to seek refuge in America was William Gibson, who was ordained minister of the Antrim congregation in 1787. This would have been the congregation covering the present congregations of Cullybackey and Kelswater. Gibson's fiery preaching, during which he reputedly prophesied the imminent downfall of the British monarchy, caught the government's attention and he was suspected of complicity with the United Irishmen. His ministry ended in 1797, but he was forced to flee to America following his refusal to take the oath of allegiance demanded of him by a civil magistrate. Accompanying him were two students for the ministry, John Black from Bracknamuckley near Port Glenowin, and Samuel B. Wiley from Moylarg near Cullybackey. As Wiley was later to reflect, they had three choices: either go against their consciences by taking the oath of allegiance, take a stand and risk execution, or flee abroad for their own safety. The departure of these men strengthened the position of the Covenanters in the United States, and in February 1798, the Reformed Presbytery of America was constituted at Philadelphia by McKinney and Gibson, along with a number of others. At this time, a young student of theology, Alexander MacLeod, a native of the island of Mull off the coast of Scotland, was taken under the care of the Reformed Presbytery. In his late teens, Alexander had emigrated to America. Coming under the influence of Covenanters there, he was led to join with them and begin theological studies with the intention of becoming a Reformed Presbyterian minister. In 1800, MacLeod completed his studies, and in November of that year, he was called to be the minister of the then United Congregation of New York City and Colden. Among those who subscribed to his call, however, were men whom MacLeod knew to be slave owners. As he was firmly opposed to the practice of slavery, MacLeod hesitated to accept the call, and instead wrote to the elders of the congregation, setting out his concerns. The Reformed Presbytery now became involved in the matter, and unanimously issued a ruling that no slaveholder should be allowed to remain in the communion of the church. The position of the Covenanters in slavery having been settled, MacLeod accepted the call and was ordained minister in July 1801. Now, it must not be thought that MacLeod had backed his fellow presbyteries into a corner and was forcing them to decide once and for all whether they supported or rejected slavery. It is clear that in the previous decade, Covenanters had indicated their absolute abhorrence of slavery. A Donegal man who was become a minister in the American Reformed Presbyterian Church, Thomas Donnelly, while still a student of theology in the 1790s, described slavery as that abominable species of murder, adding, "O America, what hast thou to account for both to God and man on the head of slavery alone? Alas, when shall God arise for the cries of the oppressed?" Having issued its decree in slavery, the Reformed Presbytery commissioned James McKinney and Samuel B. Wiley, now a minister himself, to take this ruling to congregations in South Carolina. There was to be no compromise on the issue. Those who would not free their slaves were to be excommunicated. The overwhelming majority of Covenanters submitted to this ruling. No more than a handful left the denomination over the issue. And thus Alexander MacLeod was able to write in 1802, "There is not a slaveholder now in the communion of the Reformed Presbyterian Church." In that year there appeared in print a vindication of the Reformed Presbytery's position in slavery. The author was a young Alexander MacLeod, and his book was entitled "Negro Slavery Unjustifiable." It was an important work, and has been described by one modern historian as a reasoned, logical, methodical response to Bible-based pro-slavery arguments that makes good moral sense. Before his readers, MacLeod set forth the following proposition: the practice of buying, holding, or selling or unoffending fellow creatures as slaves is immoral. In the first part of the book, MacLeod argues that slavery runs counter to the natural rights of man, one of which was a right to the exercise of freedom, which no creature has the right to deny him. Much attention is focused by MacLeod on what he describes as the pernicious consequences of the system of slavery. These were not reserved exclusively for the slave. Rather, they reflected the damage that the practice caused to both slave and slaveholder. The morals of both were ruined. In the slaveholder, it was impossible for him not to develop a deep-seated callousness as far as the condition of the slave was concerned. The slave was unable to enjoy normal family relations and develop his mental faculties. MacLeod further maintained that state-sanctioned slavery would bring down the judgment of God on American society. The toleration of slavery is a national evil, he argued. And he goes on to refute a series of objections to the principles he has just outlined. His main thrust is that in no way are blacks racially inferior to whites. The final part of his discourse, MacLeod considers ways in which it would be possible, as he phrased it, to make some improvement. He encourages readers to work towards the eradication of slavery. Here MacLeod acknowledges that he could not expect his brethren to impoverish themselves in purchasing and then freeing slaves. However, he does demand that anyone who was the owner of a slave should free them immediately. Finally, in this section of the book, MacLeod directly addresses legislators and statesmen and challenges them to act swiftly to rectify the practice of slavery. Why should they do this? MacLeod leaves them in no doubt. It is inconsistent with the natural rights of man. It is condemned by the Scriptures. It is at war with your republican institutions. It ruins the minds and the morals of thousands. And it leaves you exposed to the wrath of heaven. Throughout his discourse, MacLeod's main weapon in attacking slavery is Scripture. But he also draws on more contemporary writings to justify his proposition, including the Declaration of Independence. On several occasions, he highlights the contradictions between the principles outlined in the Declaration of Independence and the practice of slavery. He highlights the ridiculousness, especially as it must seem to Europeans. Here, the American patriot signing with one hand declarations of independence, while with the other brandishing a whip over a slave. MacLeod also quotes Thomas Jefferson, whom he describes as a writer of observation and eminence, including his famous words, "I trembled for my country when I reflected God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." The uncompromising attitude of the Reformed Presbyterian Church towards slavery in the early 19th century stands in contrast to that of nearly all other religious groupings, where disputes and rancour characterised the ways in which they tried to grapple with the subject. More than one denomination split on the issues, while in the others there was considerable unrest. It's hardly surprising that the strident views held by Covenanters on slavery did not make them popular in many quarters. Criticism could even come from within the wider Presbyterian community. One who penned his disapproval of the position of the Covenanters in this issue was William Findlay. Fascinating character. Findlay grew up in a Covenanter home in County Antrim. He emigrated to America in 1763, joining with other Covenanters there. However, as his views on the Covenanters changed, so he departed from the Reformed Presbyterians, eventually ending up in the Presbyterian Church. Along the way, Findlay rose from being a humble weaver to becoming the congressman for Pennsylvania and the original father of the house. Findlay was himself opposed to slavery. He claimed that when he first arrived in America, he avoided the Carolinas because they had been contaminated with slavery. But he felt that Covenanters had gone too far in excluding slaveholders from church membership, arguing that they'd imposed a precondition for communion, never required by Christ or his apostles. The Covenanters were undeterred by such criticisms, and until slavery was eventually abolished, maintained a consistent line that no one who owned a slave could enjoy membership of their church. I want to look at the different ways in which the Covenanters met the challenge of slavery over the next 6 decades. In other words, how did they continue to fight against slavery? Now, one of the most obvious ways was to continue to make clear their opposition to it through their publications. One who put pen to paper in support of anti-slavery was the Port Balloon-born John Black, already mentioned, who published the Bible Against Slavery. James Rennick Wilson started the first periodical to be published in America by a Covenanter. Called the Evangelical Witness, it included many items on slavery. It's hardly surprising to read that Wilson was burned in effigy and his life was threatened on many occasions. The story is told that on being asked if it were true that the Reformed Presbyterian Church did not admit slaveholders, he replied, "Yes, madam, it is true. We do not even admit horse thieves." Individual Covenanters could do their own bit to better the condition of slaves. One who did so was James Farris, who might well have been of County Antrim background. He was the principal of Pendleton Academy, a successful classical school in South Carolina that was patronised by John C. Calhoun, later to become Vice President of the United States, and himself a passionate supporter of slavery. So troubled was Farris by the condition of slaves in his district that in 1819 he bought one for $600. He then petitioned the South Carolina legislature for permission to have the slave freed. When this was denied to him, he took the slave to Philadelphia, where he had him set at liberty. Farris was later to resign his comfortable position at Pendleton, become a Reformed Presbyterian minister in Indiana. In their official pronouncements, Covenanters set forth their clear opposition to slavery. At the annual meeting of Synod in 1836, those gathered declared, "This Synod continues to maintain the duty and safety of the immediate and universal emancipation of the enslaved." There was a real sense among those gathered that the fight against slavery had reached a critical point and that their forthright opposition to it would make them targets for militant pro-slavery activists. If advocates of abolition be beaten from the arena of this contest, they said, these men of blood, in all probability, will attack the Reformed Presbyterian Church, which has in fact always been an abolition society. One of the most striking consequences of the Covenanter opposition to slavery is that in the decades prior to the Civil War, the great majority of members of the Reformed Presbyterian Church left southern states to move to northern states, such as Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. If one looks today at the distribution of Reformed Presbyterian congregations in America, one is struck by their almost total absence from the southern states. And even those congregations that can be found there have often recent origins. In his observations on this, a historian of the RP Church in America, William Melanchthon Glasgow, has written, "They maintained the purity of the church and left the comforts of the South on account of the evil influence of slavery. Rather than give up their principles, they gave up their homes." This exodus was not lost on those who stayed behind. In 1857, a memorial service was held at the site of an old Covenanter meeting house at Rocky Creek in South Carolina. The speaker was the Reverend Samuel Donnelly, son of the aforementioned Thomas Donnelly. After drawing attention to the rich Covenanting heritage of the district, Donnelly pointed out that Covenanters were now an extinct species in this area. What had happened to them? "Turn your eyes to the far northwest," Donnelly told his audience, "and there behold the 1,000 offshoots of these plantings. They have not perished, but planted and nourished here as in a seedbed. They have been transplanted into a region more congenial with their peculiar principles." By peculiar principles, he was, of course, referring to their opposition to slavery. Many of you, I'm sure, will have heard of the Underground Railroad, that network that allowed fugitive slaves to escape the southern states for Canada by a series of routes through northern states. W.R. Siebert, in his classic work on the Underground Railroad, paid tribute to the part played in it by Reformed Presbyterians. He made the comment, Scotch Covenanters did not exclude the Negro from the bonds of Christian brotherhood. It's worth making the point that following the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which ruled that all runaway slaves had to be returned to their masters, that anyone involved in the Underground Railroad was breaking the law. Those found guilty of abetting fugitive slaves escape to Canada would face imprisonment and a heavy fine. However, this did not deter Covenanters and many others from actively participating in the movement. First Philadelphia RP Church was one of a number of Covenanter meeting houses that were used as stations on the Underground Railroad. In the early 20th century, the oldest members of the congregation could still remember those times during a Sunday service when their eyes turned upwards towards the gallery and there spying a row of dark faces peering down, runaway slaves who were being afforded protection in the church. And the ways in which the church participated in the Underground Railroad varied from congregation to congregation. For example, the minister of Utica RP Church in Ohio, Armour McFarland, who was a native of the Plum Bridge area, sheltered fugitive slaves in a secret room under the front steps of his house. N.R. Johnston, with whom we began this talk, actively was involved in helping slaves, often at great risk to himself. In recalling one particularly nasty incident, Johnston lamented, "My heart bleeds when I think of these poor, hunted and heartbroken fugitives." It took a civil war, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians, before slavery in America was finally abolished. The RP Synod meeting in Utica in 1865, shortly after the conclusion of the war, resolved with satisfaction that this synod congratulate the country upon the utter overthrow of the slaveholders' rebellion, which has for the past 4 years filled the land with mourning and aimed at the destruction of the nation. Furthermore, they declared, "We heartily rejoice in every step which has been taken for the destruction of slavery, and urge the carrying forward of the work until every man in the nation, without regard of colour, stands upon a perfect equality before the laws." What I don't want to do through this talk is to give the impression that the only people who campaigned against slavery in America were Covenanters. There were many, many people in other denominations who fought long and hard to see slavery overthrown. Neither would I wish to overstate the importance of slavery, the opposition to slavery by Covenanters in America. The Reformed Presbyterian Church was a small denomination, and Covenanters were just one segment in the overall anti-slavery movement. At the same time, their contribution deserves to be highlighted, for it was undoubtedly disproportionate to their numerical strength. It's a remarkable story, and it's one in which men and women from these shores played a major role. Thank you very much for listening.